Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the last Faculty Friday of the year on this snowy day. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies. Delighted you could join us today and very pleased that today my guest is Professor Jonathan Moyer. Jonathan is Assistant Professor at the Korbel School of International Studies and Director of the Frederick S. Pardee Center for International Futures. Jonathan kind of came up through our farm system. He's has a master's degree and a PhD from the Korbel School, and he's been working for more than 15 years now on systems modeling and been involved with the Pardee Center, which he now directs. The Pardee Center is home for a really interesting model called International Futures Ifs, an integrated assessment platform which uses long-term integrated policy analysis and forecasting methods to inform efforts of governments and international organizations and corporations around the world. They work for USAID and the UN Development Program, private sector clients like Aero Electronics. Some of their work and tools has informed the US National Intelligence Global Trends report. And Jonathan consults widely for a variety of clients. Jonathan himself, European Commission, government of Kosovo, Slovenia, etc. It seems sort of most appropriate, Jonathan, to have you here today with us at the end of this very long year. But at the cusp of a new administration and the beginning of the new year just in sight, I guess, really is a moment for us to not so much look back, but to look forward in anticipation of what the future holds for us and how we might shape it. So delighted to have you join us today on Faculty Friday. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Dean Mayer. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed the previous installments of Faculty Friday, and I look forward to this.
Oh, it's always fun for me. Let's just start with the Pardee Center. Maybe you could say a few more words about what the center does, what types of questions you address, what this model is, who these clients are.
Yeah, sure. The Pardee Center for International Futures is an academic research center housed at the Korbel School. And the focus of our work is really the international futures modeling platform, as you described earlier. So the IFS model itself is a tool that's been under development for the past 4 decades. So it has quite a long history behind it, and lots of people who have contributed to its development across time. It was founded by Professor Barry Hughes, a long-term faculty member at the Korbel School as well. The tool itself is unique in the sense that it integrates or it connects across a wide range of different systems that are important for thinking about the future of human and social development in particular. Mm-hmm. So we're interested in representing things like the future of demography. So how many people are there going to be in different countries around the world, and how's that broken down by different age categories? We're interested in representing economic development and inequality. So thinking there about what's the future of economic growth looking like, and how many people live in extreme poverty, for example, and what's the future possibility of eliminating extreme poverty, or the kinds of policy choices that we could pursue there. We represent lots of these different systems. So what we're really trying to do is create a computer simulation of how the world works at the macro level. So cutting across all the key macro level trends and variables that you'd want to think about if you're making decisions that have a long-term effect. So that's the basic tool that we focus on developing. The work of the center cuts across, as you mentioned, a number of different organizations. We work fairly closely with the United Nations Development Program in particular. They're focused on the future of sustainable human development through their Sustainable Human Development Goals program. And so we work with them, helping them think about the future of human development. The African Union, helping African Union decision makers think about the future of development there. And then the US government's another big organization that we work with as well.
That's great. You know, one of the things maybe that people don't know that much about, and time doesn't permit us to go into great depth, but you use the word systems analysis, systems a lot. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about the work is that you're able to see how all those things you just talked about, demography, climate, economic factors interact with each other, so that if something happens in one dimension, you can show how it ripples through these other systems. Say a word about how those things, how that model does that, and how you're able to think across all those dimensions.
Yeah, it requires, so a systems perspective is really essential for doing the work that we do, which requires thinking about the world both in pieces and as those pieces connected within broader organizations of pieces. So a lot of academic work and modeling work in this area focuses on particular systems. So you have people who are really focused on demography. And so their model is looking at how many people are there by sex and by age. And then they make assumptions about births and deaths and migration rates. And then that's kind of like a very closed system that can help people make good decisions about the future of demography. What we do, though, is we're trying to extend the kinds of systems that we're representing that would relate to demography, for example. So as opposed to making an assumption about fertility rates being low, medium, or high in the future, we would want to say, well, what causes fertility rates to change in a country? And if you look at the data and you look at the literature in that space, it would suggest that things like family planning would be important, incomes would be important, levels of female education, in particular lower secondary enrollment, is a really important driver of changing patterns of fertility. So there we want to say, okay, if we understand these drivers, now we need to represent these. And so now we need an education model. So that requires an education representation that says, well, how many people are in school and how does that change across time? And that starts to look like a whole nother system. But that system is connected to the fertility system. So we're looking at connecting pieces in a structural way that allows people to do two things. One is to transparently see what we're assuming about the world. And the other is to ask what if questions.
Yeah.
So what if we invested more in education? How would that affect fertility and demographics? What if we invested more in family planning? How would that, et cetera, et cetera. So it's trying to represent this world, the world as a deeply interconnected space in order to improve our ability to think about the present and the future.
Yeah, it's completely, I find it completely fascinating. What I love about it is its relevance for policy. I mean, what it does is gives you a lot of policy handles, like ways to intervene. If we do this, what would happen? So I know you're not in the business of short-term forecasting for the most part, but so I won't ask you the kind of, what will happen in the next year with the Biden administration question, but it is the case that some of the issues that in some sense, all of the issues the administration faces, the new administration will face, are the product of long-term trends of all of the kinds of things you just talked about. For example, I was thinking about the issue of migration and immigration, which will face the Biden administration, the impact of political instability, persistent poverty, now climate change, climate events in Central America are going to lead to more people coming to the border. Talk about how the Pardee Center's models enable you to think about those kinds of interactions.
So we finished a recent project with USAID that looked at the drivers of migration from Central America. And there was a real question, to what degree does investment in education matter for changing patterns of migration, as compared to creating more economic opportunity, as compared to thinking more about the security space and reducing the pressure for people to migrate because of amplified security risks. So the way we would think about this is to create a representation of the things that would cause someone to leave a country, and then a representation of the things that would cause someone to want to go to another country. So these kinds of quantitative models tend to be called push-pull models, where you're thinking about push factors that are economically oriented and pull factors that are economically oriented, and push factors that are security oriented and also economically oriented. So when I think about Central American migration to the United States, for example, you need to think about how the economic conditions changing in Central America and the United States and the security situation across time. The COVID pandemic obviously has created some real acute economic need situations in lots of developing countries around the world that results from governments shutting down, the ability of labor to go out and do economic activity in order to slow the spread of the virus. But that, of course, reduces economic activity. People rely on economic activity for their livelihoods. So the kind of shock that you're talking about could happen from a COVID-oriented pandemic shock to an economy in Central America, where people lose opportunities and are forced to move elsewhere. Those economic shocks can also lead to worsening security situations. They can have reduced ability to fund security infrastructures in those countries, or people losing their livelihoods can seek opportunity elsewhere in informal economic activity, for example. So it's the combination of all these factors together that leads to changing patterns of long-term trends. I think you're exactly right to suggest that what the Biden administration is going to inherit next year and moving forward is largely the result of long-term trends that have been in place for many decades, and then how those trends react to the shocks that we're seeing, either with the pandemic or with climate change now and moving forward. I mean, that's the kind of set of dynamics that a decision maker should be thinking about and wrestling with.
Yeah, let me pick up on you. Of course, you broached the topic of COVID, which is the elephant in the room right now, and its impact on the economy. And I'm guessing that a lot of your clients, a lot of people are asking, what will be the long-term impacts of COVID on the economy? In particular, many people, certainly we at the Korbel School, really worried about the unequal impacts of this and the extent to which the impact of COVID in particular is likely to lead to greater or to exacerbate the problems that already exist in terms of inequality. What are you, is there something you're modeling? Is there something you're looking at? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I think it's a hugely important and fundamentally not fully understood question and puzzle. So the effect of COVID on inequality is likely to exacerbate trends that have been driving the world in more unequal directions across time. There's a lot of discussion about this K-shaped recovery. I think Eileen talked about this K-shaped recovery when you were both speaking previously on the Faculty Friday. Understanding how that K-shaped recovery is likely to unfold in individual countries is challenging for a wide variety of reasons. First of all, the pandemic has affected countries in very different ways. In Africa, for example, the pandemic arrived late in some places, and there were very strong civil society responses to the pandemic that really slowed the spread. So in some places that have more of a reliance on subsistence farming, there may not be much of an effect on the supply or the production of food, for example, but there is an effect on the demand for food. And so that can lead vulnerable places to remain vulnerable over longer time horizons. There are clear gender effects here. There was a recent study that shows a 1.8%, basically jobs that are more female oriented in the developing world have seen a greater increase in unemployment as a result of the pandemic than male oriented jobs. So that's
also true, as you know, in this country and in the developed world, in enormously big differences in the gender, the impact on women and men.
Yeah, so really significant effects. So we can start to see some of the dynamics unfolding, but the true macro level trend of what's the effect of the pandemic on long-term patterns of inequality is not really known. So I'll give you a real brief example, Fritz, of work that we're doing here in this space. As a part of a manuscript and as a part of work that we recently published with the UNDP, we're looking at the effect of COVID-19 on the achievement of factors like extreme poverty over long time horizons. And so we're putting forward an estimate of the number of people who live in extreme poverty around the world and what that's looking like over the next 30 years in a world without COVID, and then what that looks like in a world with COVID. So what we're analyzing here is how much does the COVID effect increase the number of people who are in extreme poverty? And our analysis would suggest that the direct COVID effect is going to increase the number of people by about 50 million people. So that's a significant chunk of people, but it's also not, it's not 10%, for example. Like there are about 750, 800 million people in extreme poverty right now around the world.
Mhm.
Then the question is, what's the long-term effect of COVID-19 on extreme poverty? And so there we're looking at two different factors. One is a factor that looks at the future of economic growth as a result of COVID. And the second is a factor that looks at the future of economic distribution as a result of COVID. On the economic growth side, I think it's really helpful to think about the effects of a shock on the factors that drive economic growth. And standard economic modeling would look at three major factors. There's labor, there's capital, and there's technology. So how has COVID affected labor, capital, and technology? Well, it's really reduced the ability of labor to participate in the economy in some sectors in particular. So the rebound from that is going to really drive inequality. What's it done to capital? Well, investment is still chugging along, and capital hasn't been destroyed. So one issue with climate change is that climate change can destroy capital. This has caused capital to not be utilized. And so you have a short-term reduction in capital use that over the 2021-2022 period is likely to rebound back in a really, really serious way. And it hasn't done so much to productivity. It's made some changes there, but that's a bit more of a mixed story. So we have a good idea about how a shock like this can affect the rebound vis-a-vis GDP growth. On the distribution side, what we're doing is we're making assumptions that are very, very generic in order to understand the long-term effect of COVID on poverty. So we assume in one scenario that it has no effect on the distribution. So we keep it flat. And then we use information from surveys and other organizations that study this in more kind of granular context to try to get a sense of the range of uncertainty that distributionally can be attributed to COVID. And there we're increasing and decreasing inequality by about 5% in the short term and about 10% over the next 10 years. But it's a really messy, complicated space. I think there's a lot of information to suggest that the inequality space is going to get worse for particular groups and sectors, but the degree to which it worsens is an area of great uncertainty.
Yeah, I recognize very complicated, very, very complicated but important question. And I'm curious, and maybe this is an unanswerable question, whether in general shocks, for example, I mean, COVID being one of them, but if you think about climate or weather shocks or other kind of disasters, in general, do they tend to exacerbate inequality on the theory that those with more means are better situated to adapt to or respond to or cope with change? And so you can think of war or violence as well. Is that something you see as a general rule in the models that you have?
I think it's a really interesting question. And I would say loosely that in general, these shocks do exacerbate inequality, but the particular matters a lot. And so take conflict, for example. We've done quite a bit of work modeling conflict dynamics. So how does a conflict impact human development? We're just about to publish something that explores that in Northeast Nigeria for the UNDP. It was led by one of our researchers, Taylor Hanna. We've published a few reports that look at this in Yemen for UNDP as well. We were really surprised in the Yemeni context in particular to identify that the conflict in Yemen has taken Yemen from a country that was ranked about in the middle of the global distribution of countries for inequality. So the top is South Africa, Brazil, your very unequal societies. Yemen was in the middle. What the conflict did was it drove Yemen to be the second most unequal country in the world. And that's particular to the conflict in Yemen. For other conflict situations, like in Afghanistan, conflict hasn't driven Afghanistan to be, I think, even in the middle of the inequality distribution. They're a very equally distributed place where there are very few haves and lots of have-nots. So I think it matters a lot on for conflict in particular, it matters a lot on the kind of particular conflict you're exploring. If you're cutting across all kinds of shocks, again, think that in general it does amplify inequality, but the particular matters quite a bit.
No, that's very helpful. Well, let me take you a little bit. I'm not sure how particular, but a bit of a tour of the world as in terms of the future scenarios that you're seeing for certain regions. So you mentioned, we were talking a little bit about Africa. A huge question, of course, in the whole development field for a long time, sort of trying to project what the future trajectory of Africa, and recognizing Africa is an enormously complex place, and certainly the particular probably matters there as well. But what do you see as the long-term economic prospects or development prospects there? And I guess importantly, because you're not in the business of just point estimates. What are the factors on which that depends?
I think that's a great question, and so Africa, obviously, super diverse place. The African Union represents 55 independent states. We model 54 of them. Within those states, there's huge diversity as well. So there's a lot going on. The future of Africa, I would start the story by talking about the future of demography. Every year, I was looking at it this morning, every year Africa, we project to add between 25 and 30 million people over the next 50 years. That's a lot of people. In East and West Africa, for example, we project over the next 20 years that both East and West Africa will add 500 million people to their projections. In 1960, one in 5 people were European in the world. By 2050, 1 in 4 people will be African. So this is a dramatic shift that's taking place in terms of the center of humanity in the world. Yeah. And Africa is developing, and it's the response to the pandemic has been pretty phenomenal in terms of not seeing widespread of the disease and learning lots of lessons about how to do kind of epidemiologically oriented disease mitigation strategies. So there's a lot of success there as well. There are also a ton of challenges. And so one way I would respond to this is thinking about what are the persistent trends that are driving the future of the continent? And then what are the things that can vary? And this is what I'm going to describe is all based on a report we produced in collaboration with the African Union a year ago. The demographic trends are undeniable and unstoppable. Urbanization is going to be a huge issue over the long term. So that's like just massive growth in urban centers. The human development trends are another trend that has been a persistently positive thing in terms of improving access to education, improving access to healthcare. Like, so human development is something that has been improving kind of, we're talking broadly and at a macro level here, pretty consistently for the past 15 years. Next, looking at trends related to climate change and natural systems. These are important drivers that are going to kind of restrain the growth in Africa. Africa, what models would suggest is that it's likely to be on the real negative receiving end of impacts from climate change. The effect on agricultural production, the effect on increased droughts and increased episodes of really severe spikes in temperature change is likely to have a really negative effect in general on development trends continentally. So when you look at those big factors, they're pushing Africa in positive and negative directions. What we then did was we looked at, well, what could really pivot? What are a set of decisions that could be taken today that would have really positive long-term effects on development? And for that, we focused on governance. And there it's about governance quality in terms of improving transparency and improving effectiveness of governance, but it's all about quantity as well. It's also about revenue generation. It's about bringing in resources, equitably transferring them where they need to be transferred in order to promote these longer term patterns of human development. And right now, investments in governance in Africa can pay really significant long-term dividends for development and help to mitigate some of the shocks that we know are coming from future pandemics, from climate change, from all the other kinds of dynamics that you've been asking me about.
That is super interesting, and we could probably spend the rest of our time just exploring what you just talked about in Africa. But I do want to I want to touch on a couple of other regions, China. There's so much attention to China now. What we've seen over the last 2-3 decades now is really extraordinary, and projections show that China's economy will surpass the U.S. Very soon. Military spending was way behind, is now about to pass us. It's an incredibly dynamic situation, and so I'm curious. So where this is heading, and again, on what does that depend? I think the Chinese I talk to are pretty confident that this is their century, not the American century. Where are we going with this? Where is this going to land? Where's in the next 2 decades, for example?
Yeah, super interesting sets of questions and dynamics. These kinds of models, like the IFS model, have been used to inform foreign policy decisions about the rise of China, and have been used since the 90s and even before that to say, well, what are the likely pathways forward for thinking about a future China? The Chinese economy, as you mentioned, is likely to pass the US in the next 5 years. In terms of market exchange rates, it's already passed in terms of a measure called purchasing power parity, but that means a little less in this kind of great power space. Chinese military spending, while as a share of GDP, it'll stay lower than the US. That's the projection that we're using. In absolute terms, will pass the US in the next 10 years. So by 2030 or so, in that kind of a space. So there are these huge kind of tectonic shifts in geopolitics and material capabilities and what matters. And that's the level that they're often analyzed in. Let me tell you about a new project that we've worked on for a while, but that we haven't fully launched, and we're hoping to launch early next year. And that's looking at new ways of measuring power that aren't just based on guns and the total size of your economy, but that are based on relationships. So what these new measures look at is how dependent is a country in Southeast Asia on China for their economy, through trade, through investment, through foreign aid. How dependent is a country on their security on a place like China, through treaties and through arms transfers, etc. What you can do is you can create a measure that says, how dependent is every country on every other country in the world? And as opposed to looking at this and saying, China is getting huge, right? It's growing faster than the US. You can say, where in particular are these changes taking place? And how do you think about relational power and dependence, and asymmetric dependence in particular, as a driver of decision making? So a country like China can say to a small country like Cambodia, hey, we're not going to do as much trade with you, or we're not going to invest as much with you if you don't veto this decision that the regional organization ASEAN is pursuing. And so with those kinds of measures, you can start to unpack this Chinese relational influence in more nuanced ways. And what you see there is even more interesting than what you see when you talk about the Chinese economy passing the US, etc. 30 years ago, influence in Southeast Asia and in Africa and in the Middle East was dominated by former colonial powers, lots of Europeans, the US, etc. Now, China is the dominant relational influencing partner for the majority of countries in Africa, which is a huge shift in terms of how foreign debt works, how countries look to external partners in terms of decision-making at the UN and other regional bodies, the degree to which authoritarian norms and values are able to be spread in a developing world and justified by leaders who say, you know what, it looks like China really responded effectively to COVID. If you look at some of these Western democracies, it doesn't seem as effective. So this broad-based kind of systemic shift in how the entire world is oriented around production, consumption, and international relations is something we can track and measure, but something where the future remains hazy. And the haziness stems from decision-making. So what do the Chinese want in this space? You see real intention with Belt and Road and other kinds of initiatives that are pushing this relational influence around the world in very strategic ways. But you also have a system that has some rigidities and fragility built into it. It's a different model of doing development. We're not exactly sure when it breaks. So that's that's how I think about the rise of China.
Yeah, yeah. And again, we could probably go on in some time. I mean, I guess the corollary is the decline in some sense of the U.S. In this space, and you several times you've used the word shift. I mean, the Africa is becoming 1 in 4 people living in Africa. China growing. India, of course, is may well surpass China, I think, in terms of population in the near future. Indonesia is a huge country. I mean, in some sense, there's what Dickens called a global shift south has been underway a long time. Can you comment on sort of, where is the U.S. in that world, and how do we think about our what part of our decline is inexorable, and what are the opportunities for the U.S. to kind of retain influence in a world where the weight of the economy, military power, a host demography, all is moving away from us?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. And from my perspective, the kinds of trends we're talking about are kind of, I think journalists talk about them as through lines. It's an idea that carries through over kind of through the clutter of other things going on. So you started by saying, well, what's the US's role in this space? And my first thought was, well, it depends on who runs the US, right? The administration we're moving away from had a totally different perspective on how to engage with the rest of the world that was very bilaterally oriented. It was punitive in some ways and kind of capriciously supportive in other ways, right? But that kind of an approach, being very different from the next administration's approach, doesn't change some of these broader, longer term dynamics. So like whoever's in charge, this is going to be something that has to be kind of thought about and discussed. The US's role moving forward and work that we've done using these kinds of bilateral measures of relational influence and interdependence has to accept the fact that China is growing more rapidly. India's growing. It's great to mention India here, even though India's foreign policy is like lacks a coherency, that except for not agreeing with Pakistan, right? And yeah, and then you have these massive growing powers. Indonesia, Nigeria. We project that Nigerian military spending will be at the same level as French military spending in 20 years. So it's 20 years from now. It's a while. And military spending doesn't completely directly connect to power, but that's a huge shift in terms of geopolitics. The future from what we would argue is that the US needs to focus on multilateral solutions to persistent problems. It should accept that China is going to rise in its neighborhood, and it should allow China to rise in its neighborhood. There's the kind of direct confrontational space is probably not strategically valuable. But if you look at decision-making in, say, Southeast Asia, while the US is going to lose out to China, in particular relationships with Thailand, with Malaysia, right? Potentially with Singapore as well. What they can do is they can use the US's traditional alliance structure with South Korea, with Japan, who also have huge influence in these countries in order to achieve specific outcomes that China might not agree with. So you can have a strategic balancing that happens between China and the US in China's backyard, but it's less focused on military confrontation, and it's more focused on what I would call neoliberal tools of relational power, which they're not a panacea, but it's better than war.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about the what ifs if we had moved forward with the TPP, for example, in terms of a trade alliance. Instead, having not done so, now the weight is shifted, right? So now China is ever more at the center of that world.
Just a quick sidebar: we had analysis in 2016 that went through to the U.S. National Security Council that took these relational power measures and showed that not joining TPP would have a real significant negative effect on U.S. relational power, and it went very high, very fast, and it was scuttled very quickly by a fairly prominent Trump person because it was too on the nose.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Really. So you really could show that the decision not to join TPP in your measures really had an impact.
Yeah, it would. I mean, to take this back to your previous comment, there's this trend, this through line, this thing that has inertia, right? Like TPP can vary the US relational influence around that trend line. It doesn't change that trend line. To change that trend line, you would need like China to have a multiple decade failure, right? Or the US to have a technological panacea that isn't shared with anyone else. So it's really limited pathways. Yeah.
I just want to let everyone listening know that we're going to open for questions. I see some questions are in the Q&A box now. So if you have questions, put them in there. I'll try to get to as many as I can. In the next, in this sort of 10 minutes we have here to you and I, Jonathan, let me ask you some questions around climate and climate change. You talked about that as one of the factors that has the prospect of holding back Africa in particular, because the impacts of climate change may be worse for them, and in some ways better for others, like Russia, for example. A couple of questions around climate. Sometimes it is suggested that the mitigating climate change is at odds with economic development, and that there are choices that you have to be made. And certainly early in the conversation, that was the case often made by developing countries. We can't afford to do the things that you're asking us to do in climate. We have to develop. We have to continue to burn coal. Is that a false dichotomy, a false choice? Are there trade-offs in this space?
That's a hard question. There are trade-offs in this space, but there is also a falseness to some of that choice. So you have countries like China who are a little slower to, even through the Paris Agreement, they're needing to, if my memory serves, they would start to decline their emissions trend by 2030. Right. The expectation on the US side is that it happens much sooner. Like when Paris was happening, I think it was pretty immediate that we would see that decline. So, I mean, there are costs to investing in new technologies that would lead to reduced or mitigated carbon emissions. And those costs can certainly be shouldered by a place like the US, and a place like China should also be able to shoulder costs like that. For me, the trade-off is there's a developing country issue. And so it would be great if in the West we didn't use as many fossil fuels and we reduced our carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And our use of renewable energy doesn't come directly at the cost of a developing country, number of people in poverty. But there is a relationship between economic growth and energy cost. And so we're also living in a world where 800 million people are living on less than $1.90 a day. And that's a tremendously large number of people. And so it's a hand wavy response, but there is a relationship between the cost of energy, and there's a relationship between mitigating carbon emissions and energy cost. So one, just real quick, when we model energy efficiency scenarios, it's in the West, they do really well to reduce carbon emissions, but it does nothing in the developing world to reduce carbon emissions. It reduces them by a very small amount. And what it does is it does increase the number of people in poverty. So there are certain policy choices that should work in the West, like riding your bike to work. That's a good idea, but it works less well in sub-Saharan Africa, for example.
Yeah, and I guess the other side of this, you've been talking about the mitigation side of this. If we think about adaptation, this is the situation where the wealthier developed countries are better equipped and often by geography better located to have fewer impacts, whereas the poor developing countries, more of the impacts are concentrated there in general, not in total. But also true, right? They're much less well situated to adapt to the changes that are coming.
Yes, and that is, I think there's something that connects to this COVID world where the shock, the COVID shock in sub-Saharan Africa partially happened because the disease was there, but there was a solid response. partially happened because of lockdowns, right? Because the economic consequences, and there's still lots of governments dealing with that. But then there's a third effect of this, which is changing patterns of international trade, changing patterns of investment. So if you're really reliant on Europe for your production or your exports, then that's going to have another effect, right? So what you do is you sit in a place where you have few resources and you're struggling to develop across multiple dimensions. And even if you respond directly to a shock, you can still have indirect effects that are continuing to kind of batter you as you try to develop. The kind of final note I would put on that is when we analyze countries that are going to achieve these sustainable development goals that the UN has, there are about 30 countries that we expect to achieve none of these goals. And those countries represent a huge share of future population growth, a huge share of future conflict and instability kinds of events and possibilities. There is this like most vulnerable group of countries that will have a difficult time responding to any future shock. And that really should be the focus of this kind of civil society support, humanitarian intervention, and I think most importantly, developmental intervention and assistance from the foreign aid community and international organizational space.
And what follows from that, or what's connected to that, is another great issue of our time, really, which is migration, movement of peoples, immigration issues here in the U.S. Just to take the climate piece, I was fascinated with an article in the New York Times a couple of days ago, really about how Russia will, quote, win because of climate change. The point being that parts of Russia that have been, too cold to farm, are now become available. And of course, the tropics are moving north. And what the thrust of the article is essentially that, in the long sweep of history, climate really does dictate where people live. And anticipating, very dramatic migration patterns over time. And the worrying was positive in some sense with respect to Russia, but the worrying part was it's also the case that these mass migrations are often, if not always, socially destabilizing, politically destabilizing. And I'm sort of curious again, thinking you were talking about the developmental consequences for countries, but what do you see in terms of the implications for migration patterns over the longer period, over the longer haul here?
In our base case, over the next 20 years, so the base case is a scenario where we say, we think this is the most likely. Understanding huge uncertainty, and we have ways of dealing with that, et cetera. But this is what we think is the most likely. We see a decrease in migration over the next 20 years as a share of the global population. Global population is growing, but that share declines a bit, and that's because the difference in economic development between the countries where people want to go and where they're coming from is reducing. And the security gap is also reducing. But that doesn't factor in huge additional stress from more severe climate scenarios. And in that kind of a world, you could absolutely see significant shifts in migration, which are destabilizing. And if people are drawn into Russia, I mean, the recent political history of Russia is not to be deeply inclusive, let's say. And so the destabilizing kind of effects of that could be quite significant. I mean, Canada is another country that also looks to benefit quite a bit from climate change, where they have a more maybe inclusive migration policy, but some things to factor in. The one thing on the climate and development nexus that I would want to bring up briefly is the countries that contributed the most to climate change on a per capita basis. So if you look at a relationship between carbon emissions per capita from the end of World War II to today, and you put all the countries there, and then you look at the climate effect. So which countries are going to be hit the hardest from climate change, from agricultural production, temperature change, yields, et cetera. The countries that contribute the most are not the countries that are hurt the most. So this is a situation where those who didn't do the harm are going to be harmed. And there's an inequality there that's profound. And that I think it's great to be working at a school like this, dealing with issues like these great big issues, and to talk in an open way about the fact that we owe, as people who contributed, to the rest of the world in ways that will be difficult or impossible to compensate or offset.
Well, I think that's a great point in which to open the conversation to others, as everyone watching can see or listening can see. I could talk to Jonathan all day, but let me turn to some of the questions that are on your mind, and we'll start. So a specific question about the hurricane season from I don't know how to pronounce, Josu Virula. Can you talk about the hurricane season that impacted Central America last month, and how many climate refugees can we expect to the point we were just talking about?
So I can't speak to the hurricane season in Central America this past month, but there are a couple of factors that would lead me to expect to see more climate migrants and economic migrants to the US over the next number of years as well. So I can't speak specifically to hurricane space, but that is one of the factors that will be, as climate change changes patterns of hurricanes across time, and Central America is expected to be negatively affected by this. You should expect to see more of that push factor leading people to find opportunity elsewhere.
Yeah, it's always hard to correlate the specific weather events for the climate, but the predictions are that we'll see more severe weather events, not just hurricanes, but droughts and other changes in patterns. Just picking up Paul Wade regarding China's resurgence. So the question is, to what degree does the Belt and Road project correlate with the US and European development in the late 1800s up to World War I? So we'll test your historical knowledge here of development.
Well, we wrote a book a number of years ago that was led by a faculty colleague named Dale Rothman on the future of infrastructure. And infrastructure is one of those, okay, a lot of the modeling we do could be criticized as being too modern. And by that, we mean that it's deterministic. It says that when you develop, all good things kind of go together. But in that process of development, if we're not criticizing the modern side of this, if we're saying you do need to sequence development along a set of patterns, you need educated people to take higher level jobs and healthier people to do more kind of value oriented work, et cetera, then this infrastructure development is a huge component of that. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative is a very smart, strategic, and long-term oriented Chinese planning process, saying this is our best bet for being the center of this future hub and spoke network of economic production. And I don't know if in the US and Europe in the late 1800s there was that kind of foresight. My history isn't that good, my knowledge isn't that good, but on the Chinese side, it's certainly, I think, it's an investment in their future geopolitical relevance and dominance around the world. And on the US side of things, we lack strategy. We lack foresight. We have great strengths in other areas, but we don't focus on that planning side.
The last time I was in China, we were in Xi'an, and we got a briefing about the Belt and Road there, but the fascinating part was that Xi'an was the start of the Great Silk Road. And so Belt and Road, very, very, very much imagined as the sort of reclaiming of China as the center of commerce and the world. So to your point, it is, whether it will work or not, it's another question, but it's definitely a strategy. It's very intentional.
Yeah, and you're right. The Silk Road this is a reorientation, not a new orientation of China as the center of this, right? And so, yeah, this Western dominance may have just been a blip on a longer historical scale.
As imagined, at least in China, it is a blip, the last century or so. Abdullah Sharifi asks, Thomas Piketty proposes a wealth tax be imposed on wealthy individuals and proceeds to be used regarding inequality across the globe. Yeah, have you tested, as a model tested this thesis? Do you have anything to say? Does the IFS model help us think about that?
Not really, but it's like, so let me explain what not really means. What not really means there is, if you're trying to say, would a wealth tax be effective? That's a whole set of questions that we can't really address. That gets into the nuance of policy making that, the Scrivener Institute that's at the Korbel School, they're focused on policy and like in a much more granular way than we are. We're more interested in the effects of a successful policy or not. But the reason I said kind of is because in some ways it's almost just a simple accounting kind of question, right? How much money is there in the top 1%? How much could be taxed? And then how much would it cost to redistribute? And then how much would that redistribution have an effect on the global extreme poor? It's like food, right? We don't have hungry people because we can't make enough food. We have hungry people because we can't distribute the food. It's the same with money. We obviously don't have poor people because like they're lazy or we don't have the resources to support them. We do. We just don't have a good way of distributing them. So, Abdullah, if you have a good solution for how to implement a policy like that, I think it definitely would be something that would reduce extreme poverty around the world.
Yeah, and certainly as you flag a big issue for many of our colleagues at the Korbel School, trying to think about how you have a more equitable distribution of the pie without compromising the ability to produce and et cetera. So this is a big issue. So we'll kick that one to the Scrivener Institute. I appreciate
Good luck, Naz.
For that. Question here, you left out the Middle East. So where do you see the Middle East region as you discussed Africa and China and Asia? Of course, Middle East again is a complicated place, but what are the long-term trends there?
I mean, long-term trends that people have talked about for quite a while is this shift away from fossil fuel dependency and this trend. When I was a much more junior person, there were people writing about peak oil and things like that, and trying to use models that were modeling energy to say that the Middle East is going to go through a period of dramatic destabilization because of reduced reliance on fossil fuel production. The peak oil stuff isn't right. I mean, it misses prices, it misses lots of important kinds of factors. But there is a real insight and knowledge to the underlying insight, which is the fact that there is going to be this significant shift away from resource extraction towards something else. And that requires the economies to be kind of restructured. It requires human development. Like I talked earlier about modernization, and there the typical story is you build a government, you get a territory, you start to invest in people and infrastructure and how governance works, and you go through this process, and eventually you end up with Luxembourg or something, where you have this, some people do agriculture, but more people do services, and it's this very developed kind of inclusive place. When you add a huge amount of oil into that puzzle, that changes all of the dynamics. It increases rent-seeking behavior, increases corruption, it makes it more difficult to export things. So all of those factors will need to be dealt with as these economies shift through that space. Obviously, it's a complicated region in terms of politics. That's not something we deal with as much, though the foreign influence of China in the region is something that you can't, it's undeniable. It's another one of those places where China has made significant and strategic gains quietly in some cases, right? At the expense of Russia in many cases as well. So demographically, right, there's still change, there's still growth in human development. There's it's a standard kind of development story. In some ways, the Middle East development story is more similar to South America than some other regions. So, but we don't do a lot of work focused on the Middle East as a region. We do some particular work like Yemen and other kinds of countries like Egypt, but less regional trends in that space.
Well, you anticipated one of the other questions just to complete the world tour, which is Latin America versus the US. And I'll ask the same.
Yeah.
I think implicitly the question is is the same, which is wither Latin America. Again, a complicated, multi-country, faceted region.
Yeah, I mean, Central and South America have obviously, huge, as you're saying, a lot of variation. In terms of development, there have been a long history of pretty low growth rates. People talk about the middle income trap as a particularly acute issue in Central and South America in particular, where you get to a middle income level of development on a global basis, and then your growth rate just kind of slows. And the argument there are lots of arguments for why that can occur, but governance is a good one. A lack of investment in infrastructure previously, or human development, education, health is another kind of good set of potential examples there. It's developing in this, I mean, we do less work, I think, in South America and the Middle East on a long-term development trends basis because they're not outlier regions, right? So Africa's population growth and change in human development is just so dramatic. The only historical comparison that I can make to Africa's development is China's development. China, extreme poverty in 1990 went from 65% to 2000, basically zero. So it's just a huge shift, right? Hard to not notice that. In South America, there's less for me to focus on. I think governance is the persistent kind of question in Central and South America as well.
Yeah. We're almost out of time, so let me turn back to one of the last questions here from Abdullah Sharifi. But really, he's asking a question about whether how you capture uncertainties in a model. But let me add to that, as in your modeling, you really are not trying to produce point estimates. You have uncertainties, but you also are developing scenarios. So it's not the sort of normal bell curve with a single point estimate and a curve around it. Talk about kind of the philosophy of that kind of modeling as a tool for policymakers, the kind of clients that you work for.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's fundamentally important. If a policymaker doesn't talk to me about the uncertainty, I get very nervous because the point estimates, I think it's a fool's errand to make these single point estimates without dealing with uncertainty. The model's called International Futures. And so when we abbreviate it, we call it IFS, so ifs. Yeah. And that's very intentional. It's because we're interested in multiple ifs. Mm-hmm. What if this? What if that? What if the effect of COVID is greater in this region or that region? What if the effect of COVID doesn't reduce inequality? What if? So the way we frame the analysis from a policymaker perspective is we start with a trend that we say that's our best guess. This is the most likely unfolding of events that we think will take place in this system. Then we say, well, what are the key drivers and how can they be varied? And we do that in ways that are conceptually oriented. So it's not this statistical representation of if we vary it by one standard deviation here or there, then it has this kind of effect longitudinally. It's more conceptually oriented. So what if China experiences a significant adjustment in how governance works that leads to a reduction in growth, an increase in out-migration, whatever. And so you represent a story or a narrative about how the world's likely to unfold quantitatively. I mean, our time is done here, so I don't want to go too far, but the big takeaway is that the world is not normally distributed. So representing it as such is a problem. Statistics are super useful, but framing scenarios that help us understand how things are unfolding and the kinds of choices we can make today and the effect that those will have on variables we care about, that's fundamentally what we're interested in.
Well, that is a lovely place to end the conversation. I wish we could talk longer. The world is not normally distributed, but you're in the business of helping us anticipate or think about scenarios to inform choice. What a great thing. It's such a pleasure to talk with you today. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all of you who are watching today. Wish you all a very happy holidays and a wonderful new year. I'm expecting 2021 to be better than 2020, so something to look forward to. Anyway, happy holidays to all, and thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.